Hey there, classes. Welcome back. Sorry I haven't done a video in the last week or so, but last week I was in for skin cancer surgery on my left ear. Had a giant patch over one ear. I probably could have still made a video, but I was kind of rocking the Van Gogh look. But got the bandages off, which is a good thing, and we will use that to talk about some of the stuff that we've learned in here. We are trying to learn a little bit about life and how it works, and also how to preserve that life on the planet. This right here feeds into our current events and news stories, so let's jump on in. The other day, we had the guest scientists come on by and talk to the class. One of the things that they had mentioned was polymers. I wanted to talk a little bit more about polymers. We hopefully remember a little bit about amino acids joining together to make proteins a little while ago. Cells as little factories that make proteins for the most part. And when you're looking at protein factories, those protein factories need the raw materials. And the raw materials are the amino acids. Way back when we saw Mark Watney on Mars, the fictional movie The Martian, we were talking about how when he was getting low on proteins, he didn't have the raw materials that were needed to make all the proteins he needed to maintain his body mass and his muscle and nerve function. So when you're looking at polymers, one of the things you're thinking about is a chain. It often gets compared to links in a chain. You've got all the little links, the monomers, the single pieces, and then the polymers. Think about polygons in your math classes across the hall. The polygons, many sides, polymers, many parts. One of the things that we're seeing in the modern world all the time, remember, is the burning of this chunk of coal. Again, this is that one that came from my grandfather's backyard way back in West Virginia. And one of the things that we've learned to do with that coal, with the oil, with the petroleum products, is make lightweight things like this right here. In the back of the room, I've got a full-size surfboard, and that surfboard underneath the surface has things that look like, just grab this out of the box here, these little polystyrene little foam things. You might remember a story I told in class a while ago about how my brother and I had spilled some polystyrene, some of those little beads in the backyard of the house where we grew up in Millbrae, excuse me, and years later, 10 years later, before we moved out of that house, we cleaned up as many as we could, but in the place where we had spilled some, 10 years later, we found a little stash that was under the ground while we were doing some gardening. They looked right like they did the day we had spilled them. That stuff never goes away in our environment, and that led to one of our current events stories, which was all the little polystyrene pieces that were unfortunately found washing up on the shores at Lake Tahoe. When you check out this polystyrene, it's terrible for the environment. The challenge for our generation and your generation is going to be to think of some way to clean up the plastic that we are dumping into the environment at an absolutely unprecedented rate. The surfboard thing I was checking out that I have in the back of the room here, my old surfboard, I'm going to get it recycled properly. But honestly, the next time I get a surfboard, the next surfboard that I'll save up for, I'm going to go for something like this. There's a gentleman in town, a guy by the name of Yatrakis, look him up, and he makes good old-fashioned wooden surfboards. This one is a board for doing some body surfing, but this is something that will eventually break down in the environment, much, much better for the environment than that polystyrene and the plastics that we see out there right now. Later on, when we do ocean health, when we do ocean acidification, when we also check out, for example, the plastic gyres that are in several oceans around the world, we'll be talking about Midway Island in particular and all the plastic that's collecting there. And a final word on our environmental health. Last year was the warmest year ever recorded worldwide. Why? It's because we're busy burning this for fuel still. So remember, when we're talking about the big picture, the sixth extinction that we're in right now and environmental change and degradation, one of the big things that we're talking about in this class is how we're taking carbon compounds that have been sequestered in the crust for millions of years, and we're now burning it and putting it in the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide, which is helping heat our planet. Today, as we simultaneously talk about the environment and about how life works in general, we talked a little bit about Punnett squares and a little bit about blood type. When you're looking at the blood types A, O, B, and AB, keeping it a little bit simple, we kind of kept out the rhesus factor, the positives and the negatives for now, but it's a good tie-in with alleles and how they're expressed. In terms of blood type, You can have blood type A, you can have blood type B, you can have what's called codominance. That's why I'm using the blood type today. AB is a good example of what happens when you have two capital letters, if you will, two dominant alleles. How are they expressed? They're both expressed. And then finally, O, which is recessive. It's a recessive blood type. You have to get O from both parents to be able to get type O blood. So a good example of Punnett squares there. Remember Mendel, who worked with the pea plants and was doing crosses like this, and Darwin, they were contemporaries, but they never worked together. They lived around the same time, and they were doing their work in different places, and they never really compared notes on this sort of thing. So when you're checking out this Punnett square up here, remember we always have the mom on this side of the Punnett square, the dad on the side, and when we're looking at two capital letters, if you will, we're looking at codominance. This person right here, this child right here, 50% of their children, 1-to-2 ratio, would have AB type blood. So I wanted to point that out as a good example of the things that we're doing with Punnett squares. Yesterday, walking over here, we had a good example of Punnett squares in this handout right here, which went home with the students. Remember, anytime you get one of these handouts where you get the color in and the color and pasting, they get put into the notebook. These are never handed in. But this one showed the classic dominant and recessive allele and how it works out in the ratios of the offspring. Today's handout was similar, but it had to do with the voyage of the HMS Beagle, the cutest name of any ship ever in the history of science. But the HMS Beagle, as you might remember, was the ship that brought Darwin around the world. It was originally going to be a 3-year journey, but it was a 5-year journey instead. And when Darwin returned back to England, he spent quite a bit of time checking out the beak shapes of the finches that he had observed in the Galapagos Islands in particular. And remember, the beak shape had everything to do with the diet that the birds ate. So that was the main thrust of checking out Darwin's observations. By looking at the beak shape, you could tell exactly what food was available. And it was stunning when they started to see how quickly the beak shape changed when the food sources changed. For example, droughts or extra wet years would shift a little bit the abundance of seeds versus nectar in terms of what the birds were eating versus insects. And when you looked at the beak shape, the birds would very, very quickly adapt to the different diets that were available. So that's where we leave it today. Please make sure you check out the notes online and make sure you get the notes down. And remember, when we're talking about going forward, especially when we get to our unit on the ocean, which is about mid-February in here, we're going to be talking quite a bit about polymers, our oceans, and what to do about the plastic pollution problem that is plaguing the world right now. All right, take care, everyone.